Welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin and a very special guest, someone that I've been looking forward to discussing things with on the show for a long time, Cameron Macgregor. Of course, if you watch the Backlash, the show hosted with Vince James, Dave Riley, and Rebecca Hargraves, as well as our guest here today, you'll be familiar with his analysis on everything going on in the world, the things affecting us here on the domestic front, the state of the Donald Trump presidency, and of course, I think a lot of his analysis touches on our subject here, which is covering what we believe to be the ongoing Third World War. So be sure to check out The Backlash. It's a fantastic show. We've already had Vince James on, so if you want to see more of that kind of stuff, check out that episode. It'll be linked below. So this is our second time having a Backlash host on the show, so very happy to have it happen. We are going to get into all sorts of subjects ranging from potential financial collapse in the future, war between Israel and Iran, situation between Russia, Ukraine, obviously, as well as some other more philosophical ideas that are affecting, a sort of revolutionary ethos here at home in the United States. But before we introduce himself, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing fantastic, Conrad, and you are completely correct. There is certainly a lot to discuss, especially going into the March period of 2025. So I'm very excited to be here with Mr. Macgregor.
No, it's going to be a fantastic show here. So Cameron, without further ado, feel free to tell the audience your background, your expertise, why you talk about what you talk about, those sorts of things. Go ahead.
Conrad, Dmitry, thank you so much for hosting me. For those of you who do not know, my name is Cameron Macgregor. I am a writer, a YouTuber, an entrepreneur, investor. As whatever you want to describe me, I suppose, as is what I will be to you. But for the purposes of this discussion, think of me as a geopolitical economic thinker. I have a Substack called Men in the City, which is all about the rise of what I call Masco nationalism, subject we can talk more about in a moment. And I also, as Conrad mentioned, am a co-host on The Backlash, where we talk about all things related to the future of the Western world.
The Backlash is a great show. I think a lot of people in the dissident right have been converging and having these shows where they come together, a lot of people that have their own audiences and then can bounce things off each other. And that's one of my favorite panel shows currently existing right now. So all that will be linked below for those of you that want to check that out. But diving right in, I eventually really want to have a discussion about what's going on here at home, what you view the political solution to be or not to be, but just in the interest of whetting the appetite of our World War III analyst audience, Cameron, we discuss a number of fronts, as we call them on the show, obviously Russia, Ukraine, the situation in the Levant. At certain levels, the situation even in Venezuela enters this sphere. Of course, the future conflict between China and Taiwan, and specifically in the Levant right now, the big news is about war between Israel and Iran. Of course, Israel is openly talking with Donald Trump and others about striking Iran's nuclear capabilities. And we, of course, have been talking about this on the show for years now, largely due to some prophecies that Orthodox saints have been talking about this for a long time. But we've also been noticing, the boiling over situation as Greater Israel expands, even before October 7th occurred, if you understood what was going on in the West Bank at that time. So I've heard you talking about this for a very long time. You have videos months and months and months old talking about strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities in a very real way with real hard analysis. So I'm wondering right now, as we are in mid-February 2025, what do you think is the future of that specific conflict? And are there any other sort of major fronts that you see emerging? Again, I know your expertise is in sort of finance and economics. And you can tie that in as well. What do you see as the sort of emerging newer, hotter fronts among the ones that are sort of dormant right now?
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word front, because that term comes straight from World War I, as I'm sure both of you know. And if I look at the world today, if I survey a cross-section of the various fronts, as you call them, the world resembles, to me, World War I. Now, I suppose you could go back to other periods, perhaps the end of the Napoleonic Wars as an example, on the way to the concert of Europe. You may also go back to the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome as sort of these crucial inflection points where the balance of power in the world shifted. That is, in fact, what is happening. The balance of power in the world is very definitely shifting, as far as I can tell, from west to east. Now, to your question, to the Levant, to the Middle East appears to be the epicenter of that conflict. And ironically enough, it appears to be the epicenter of that conflict for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the United States and its national interests. It seems to have everything to do with the Zionist project. There's a very good book that was just released by Ilian Pape. I don't know if either of you know who he is, but he's basically a Sephardic Jew that's written extensively on the history of Israel and talked about the gradual conquest or colonization. He calls it settler colonialism of Israel. And that more or less began almost 80 years ago. Now, I mention that because there is a noteworthy 80-year cycle that seems to terminate these Zionist projects. The first, of course, being King David and King Solomon in ancient times. And then the second, as most people know, ended more or less with the diaspora when the Romans sacked Jerusalem. These states seem to sort of reach their denouement at the 80-year period. Now, Donald Trump and the United States seem to fit into this for the same reasons that Biden has and Obama and all the rest of it. And that appears to be that the U.S. political system has been completely captured by Zionism. I think to a greater extent today than we've ever seen. And what that Zionist project is basically doing is trying to leverage its influence on the United States and the broader West, but really the United States as a battering ram to smash any and every threat as they perceive it in the Middle East to establish greater Israel. Not just to establish greater Israel either, but to restore a sense of confidence in their own people and fear in the Arabs, Persians, and Turks around them. However, what the Israelis do not appear to understand, and this mirrors the ignorance in Washington, D.C., is that that balance of power has shifted so dramatically that the United States does not have the asymmetrical power that it once had, that the Israeli Defense Force is a shell of what it once was. And by contrast, Iran is stronger. It's backed by the BRICS, specifically the Russians. The Turks are stronger. Even the Arab states, I think, as corrupt and decadent as many of the Arab regimes are, the Arab street, I think, is getting stronger based on something I've talked about on my show called Asabiya. So effectively what we've got is we've got a chessboard that's increasingly trending towards some kind of a geopolitical event that could bring us to a world war. I think that's likely to start if it happens in the Middle East for the reasons that you've implicated.
No, absolutely. And we've been essentially proclaiming the same conclusions to our analysis quite recently, especially with the fact that no matter how many countries like Russia, for example, the United States, or outside actors attempt to kind of slow the regional conflict down, or at least apply the fire extinguisher to the hypothetical menorah in the situation, it just simply doesn't go out. It's simply the conflict continues to reignite and the tensions continue to spiral out of control, especially given the recent events in December of Syria, which took, I think, a lot of people by surprise. One thing I think we have noticed, Cameron, is in conflicts, sometimes, for example, in a war between Russia and Ukraine in the last few years, essentially a conflict can sometimes force a huge internal change in a nation itself. And America hasn't really had a proper hot war on its own soil, obviously never, but never a really civilizationally changing war since you could probably say Iraq, maybe even Vietnam, which has really changed the social dynamics. And what we see in Russia today is even the SMO, the special military operation, and the conflict with their neighbors in Ukraine have essentially forced the Russian people to accept certain realities like abortion being bad, for example. Like the criticism for abortion has risen several times over. In Russia, there's a new red pill movement, right, which kind of advocates for men's rights for the first time. Finally, the Russians have realized that since the Bolshevik Revolution, there's been a sort of gynocratic, creeping, feminist, heavy, sort of post-patriarchal culture that has taken over, essentially, and has been perpetually in control of Russian society for about 108 years with no one really stopping it and putting an end to it. And there's also clear noticing of like ethnic, cultural, religious patterns who is in control of certain power structures, especially in the neighboring Ukraine, which is, has become like the product of many memes and essentially the subject matter. So essentially wars can sometimes force certain people to introspectively fix themselves and change. However, wars have always been, or at least for the last 300 years, taken advantage of by economic actors, especially those in the banking industry. So what can you say, Cameron? Is a World War III potentially going to bring about some major cultural shift in the world, globally speaking, especially given Russia-Ukraine? We see Russia becoming even more conservative today, despite all the economic tensions. Could the same possibly happen to the United States? Could that be a catalyst, for example, if something happens in the Middle East, for American society to change and improve for the better?
Yeah, there's a very famous book called Man, the State, and War, which was written by Kenneth Waltz. And it basically said there's three levels of analysis. There's the state itself and the interactivity of those states, but really what happens domestically. Then there's the international system of states. And then there's the individual or the nature of man as the base level of analysis. I've written a series of essays borrowing that theme and using it to explain the world today. And the topic of my essay, and I've made some videos on this as well, it's called Identity, Holy War, and Radicalization. What wars often do is they are the confirmation or the culmination of changes that have already occurred. So when I say identity, holy war, and radicalization, what specifically do I mean? Well, let's take identity first. What seems to be happening in a Huntingtonian sort of sense is that identity, national identity, civilizational identity, identity at the street level, which is what we're seeing in the Arab world, for example, what Ibn Khaldun called asabiya, the sort of coalescence into a broader ethnos or religious identity. That seems to be the dominant theme happening everywhere in the world. Now, a lot of folks will point to the West and say, but the West is the exception to that, or perhaps is a trend in a different direction, a trend that many people call globalization. But I would argue that actually it's happening in the West too. More on that in just a moment. The second is holy war. I emphasize holy war as a term because that's what's really happening in the Middle East today. If you go to Wall Street today and you ask people about what's happening in Gaza, what they will tell you is that this is continuity from previous skirmishes between the IDF and Hezbollah or Hamas or other regional actors that have played out over recent decades. That is not what's happening in the Middle East today. What's happening in the Middle East is a clash. It's a collision between the forces of Zionism and the House of Islam. And that is very definitely a holy war. It is a spiritual war that the United States is being drawn into. In a similar sense, you're seeing that collision in Ukraine. If you read Putin's speeches, if you read the work of Alexander Dugin, what they talk about is that the special military operation has basically been a staging ground for the mobilization of Russian national consciousness because they perceive that the NATO expansion into Ukraine, the corruption, the attack on Russian-speaking peoples as an existential threat to their identity. And that identity has completely transformed since the Soviet Union and the subsequent shock therapy afterwards that devastated Russia in ways that people in the West simply do not understand. So for them, it is equally a spiritual war, a war that they must win. They have no choice, which is why if we're going to come to agreement, to some kind of a peace agreement with the Russians, we're basically going to have to accept the status quo that they've created on the battlefield. Okay. Then if you look east, you're seeing a similar surge of self-confidence in states like India and China. Now, China in particular is a country that I'm familiar with because I lived in Hong Kong for a period of time. And I do have an understanding of Chinese culture and history. And what's happening in China is they've finally broken free from the century of humiliation. They finally got some momentum to get back to that civilizational status that they had before. Again, this is something that's just not understood in the West because when we think about these countries, it's binary, right? It's either you're part of the neoliberal order or you're an authoritarian state. That is a very poor framework to understand the world because as we've established here, these states are changing based on identity and holy war. For the Chinese, they don't interpret what's happening necessarily as a spiritual war, but they do perceive themselves as on the civilizational ascent, and they perceive the West as sort of on the civilizational decline. So that brings us to the third piece, radicalization. Radicalization is what's happening, I think, all over the world, but especially in the West, especially in the United States and Western Europe. Now, what do I mean when I say radicalization? Over the last 50 years, there have been some seismic changes that have shaken up masculinity in general, but the white demographic in particular. Immigration has been devastating to the white male psyche. the shift in the sexual marketplace, largely driven by feminism, but also by online dating, has been devastating to the white male identity, self-confidence, et cetera, et cetera. Economic squeeze. So the West is in effect deindustrialized since the 1980s. So if you look at all of these various fronts, what's happening is that the subject of them, the subject of the experiment, if you will, that has been imposed upon us by overarching authority. You might call them the elites, you might call them the gerontocracy. It's a term that I use, basically the rule of the old, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean people that are older. It just means that paradigms that have been established since more or less the 60s. We are the product, young men in particular, Gen Z and millennials, we are suffering the consequences of all those paradigms. And as a result, rather than sort of just lying down and dying in large numbers without any pushback, we have begun the process of pushing back. We have begun to radicalize against it. And this is manifest not just in very self-evident forms like the Groyper movement in Nick Fuentes, for example. It's also manifest in the manosphere. It's manifest in the cryptosphere. And these movements are spreading across the Western world. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, the parliamentary elections that were held in Europe this past summer basically demonstrated a categorical shift to the right, the nationalist right, manifest in all these new sovereign nationalist parties that are largely being driven by young men, okay? So you're seeing radicalization in the minds and the psyches and the spirits of white men who've been squeezed by a system that's trying to destroy them, that's literally trying to eliminate them in the sexual marketplace, to discard them economically, to crush them politically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A similar kind of radicalization, I think, is happening in the Middle East, particularly among the Arabs, Turks, and Persians against Israel. And obviously that's going to fuel this war that we're talking about. So those are the three levels that I've used to sort of explain what's happening. And if you add them all up, you've got a very combustible mix. That being said, war is not inevitable. It ultimately depends on one thing at this stage, and that is whether or not the United States specifically, can decouple from the Zionist project. If it can, then war can be averted. There's no question about it. If it cannot, then we're headed into some major geopolitical conflict that will be at least regional, largely in the Middle East, and could spread around the world, sort of like World War I. And the aftermath of that will be this rebalance of power in the world that will, beyond a shadow of a doubt, lower the United States, or rather the United States will sort of be subordinate in a broader morass of powers as opposed to the dominant partner.
I really like how you refer to these more metapolitical and kind of cultural battlefronts as, fronts themselves, because I would view the sort of gender war, that elite capital has waged, on society, pitting women, against men with this feminist nonsense. I would also view, of course, the financialized economy and how it's been weaponized against people. All of these are just as much fronts in what I would consider the ongoing or the early stages of the Third World War as the war in Ukraine is, as Israel's advances in Gaza and the West Bank, as what's going on in Syria. All of these things, I think, it's very McLuhan-esque in the sense because, Marshall McLuhan said World War III is a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation. And I think that's exactly what we are witnessing right now, because part of the reason there can't be as many advances and why the drone warfare is becoming so meticulous, even in a place like Russia, Ukraine, is because worldwide perception is such an important part of the war itself, even more so than in the First and Second World Wars because of mass media and all these other sorts of things. And I think you're talking about the US stepping down as the main unipolar power in favor of these rising civilizations. Of course, Russia reemerging from the civilizational vat that was communism now as a, Orthodox Christian, white, European nation state. And of course, really more of a somewhat imperial power in a positive sense. And you're talking a lot about China and how ultimately the US is going to have to be put in a confrontation with a lot of these states. Right now, of course, we're seeing on the foreign policy front, the toning down of rhetoric in favor of Ukraine, Pete Hegseth talking about no NATO membership, talking about how they're going to have to give up territory, all of these sorts of things. Is this an obvious refocus towards Iran and China because they realize they are not going to be able to keep it up against Russia if there are confrontations with these two groups? And does this signify, is there a split in the foreign policy establishment right now on who people who want to, of course, confront Iran, people who are diehard Jewish Zionists or Christian Zionists that want to rebuild the Third Temple, make the Greater Israel Project real, and destroy all of Israel's regional enemies, as opposed to those who are really focusing more on a confrontation with China due to more prescient economic realities? Is that a real thing that's happening? And what do you think? People always say, a sort of dying empire begins to lash out more erratically. They ironically do begin to reemerge and try to do more random territorial expansions like what we're seeing with Trump in Greenland and Canada and these other places. So what do you think is the future of the more aggressive foreign policy establishment, as it does appear that the Ukraine project is being toned down?
Yeah, it's a good question. And implicit in your question is, I think, a confusion about what real policy is in Washington, D.C. And this is something I've stressed to people that are rather optimistic and sanguine about Donald Trump. The glib answer to your question is the Trump election and Hegseth's comments, a reshuffling of agencies, firing certain people, etc. Is that a categorical shift in a new direction? No, it is absolutely not. To continue the World War III or World War I theme, Ferdinand Foch, who was a French general that basically saved the Anglo-French forces after the beginning of the war in August of 1914 at a battle called the Battle of the Marne. Some people call it the Miracle of the Marne. He said, and I quote, "My center is giving way. My right is retreating. Situation excellent. I am attacking." I can think of no better expression of the Trump mindset. That is exactly what Trump is doing. His center, if you take my analogy further, is basically the financial economic system in the Western world centered in the United States. That's beginning to give way. Something we can elaborate on in just a moment. My right is retreating. Well, I would say the right is basically the imperial overstretch of the United States. That is equally under siege for all kinds of reasons. And what's the response to this? Well, Trump is attacking. He's launching a trade war that I don't think is in the best interest of the country. And I think it could very definitely boomerang for reasons that we can expand on in just a moment. He's also using a lot of very harsh rhetoric, not just towards China, but in general, in a very, I would say, haphazard and clumsy fashion. Does that belie some kind of broader strategy? No, I don't think it does. Now, to Donald Trump's credit, I think he understands intuitively, if not explicitly, that any major war will likely destroy him. It will likely destroy his administration. And anybody that has any cursory knowledge of American history knows that basically the presidents that are successful tend to end wars, right? These are people like Eisenhower, for example. You could also argue Nixon, certainly Reagan. The presidents that are failures tend to start wars, right? These are presidents like LBJ, Truman, George W. Bush, okay? So if you look at that simple delineation in the 20th century alone, what it tells you is getting into wars are a bad idea. However, the problem for Donald Trump is he's an old man and he sees the world, fundamentally speaking, in the 20th century framework. So he thinks the United States is a few policies removed from reasserting its hegemony in the world. This is what's driving his trade policies. For example, when it comes to China, his view is simply that the Chinese are at the end of their growth story, that they're not really rising, that they have a real estate crisis, that they have hundreds of millions of poor Chinese, that there's provincial squabbling. And so now is the time to sort of strike them. He may also believe the propaganda coming out of the West, that the Russians have taken heavy losses in Ukraine, that their economy is actually not very robust. Similarly, he may also believe what some in the intelligence community have told him, namely that Iran can be dealt with very quickly in a kind of blitzkrieg from the air, whether through missile strikes or drone strikes or, God forbid, but potentially tactical nuclear attacks, things of this nature. Who knows what he believes, but either way you slice it, he remains of the belief that the United States has asymmetric power. And so he's pursuing the maintenance of the empire, if you will, both the dollar empire and the imperial empire at the same time. So I don't see a marked shift in a new direction. What I do see is a willingness to do deals. That's sort of how Trump operates. Now, that in and of itself is a tactical shift, but here's the problem, okay? In order to affect real change in Washington, D.C., you have to reorganize the government. There's something I call the triad. The triad is basically three components. It's the executive branch, it's the intelligence suite, which is basically three things. It's the NSA, it's the FBI, it's the CIA, and thirdly, it's DOD. If you really want to programmatically shift the foreign policy of the United States, you have to demolish that triad. You have to restaff it and reorganize it in a way that's congruent with the policy that you're trying to implement. Trump has no idea how to do that. What he's doing is basically putting people he thinks look good on TV in charge of these various departments so that they echo his various sentiments. That is altogether different from having a diplomatic program that can actually establish the kinds of reconnection with the Russians and other groups around the world for a strategic realignment. I just don't see evidence that such a framework shift is underway. At the same time, there is also what I call the Zionist triumvirate that has outsized control of his government. And I'm going to give you three specific folks who are the triumvirate as far as I can tell. Number one is Jared Kushner. I have heard rumors, though unsubstantiated, that Trump's proposal on Gaza to turn it into some kind of real estate project came directly from Jared Kushner. Of course, for those of you who don't know, Jared Kushner's father is a criminal. I think he's now actually a U.S. ambassador in some way, shape, or form. You guys can check me and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is the case. But Jared Kushner has tremendous influence over Donald Trump, and he did in his first term. So that's member number one of the triumvirate, a self-evident Zionist, okay, committed to the debacle in the Middle East. The second is Howard Lutnick. Howard Lutnick was in charge of the Trump transition team. He is also vying to be the Commerce Secretary, and he's going to run the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Howard Lutnick was former CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. He is a Wall Street banker and a committed Zionist as well, okay? He shadows Trump wherever he goes. That's number two. And then number three, lurking in the background, is Miriam Adelson. Miriam Adelson is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, who's a billionaire that orchestrates huge amounts of financial capital and influence. And Miriam Adelson gave Donald Trump, I think, $100 million to win the election. And I think basically secured the guarantee that the Trump administration would back Netanyahu in whatever he wants to do. Okay. So if you add all of these things up, Trump says a lot of things, but he doesn't really have control of the triad. Second, he doesn't have a diplomatic program in place to facilitate this realignment, and he doesn't have a vision for how to do that. And then thirdly, you've got the triumvirate operating behind him. What all of that adds up to, guys, is continuity of government. And that means that we're sliding maybe in a slightly oblique angle into war, just as we were under Biden.
You were right. Charles Kushner is about to at least be the ambassador to France under Donald Trump.
There you go.
Wow.
And just to be clear, one additional note on this, our entire diplomatic corps is a fraud in the United States. You become a diplomat basically by donating huge amounts of money to the president. Okay. And furthermore, if you don't have lots of money, and I know this closed hand because I've seen people go through the process, it's very difficult to become a U.S. ambassador because the U.S. State Department doesn't give you much budget. In other words, to pay staff and go on trips and host parties and things of that nature, a lot of that is financed by the diplomat, whomever that person may be, never mind the confirmation hearing, which is just a clown show as well. So again, what I'm giving you is just a sense of the magnitude of the problem that Donald Trump faces. And what's compounding it is that I don't think Donald Trump understands a lot of what I just said either. I think his view is I can sign some executive orders and it'll magically go away. That's just not the way it works.
No, I think it's excellent symbolism that Charles Kushner, representative of a certain elite, is now, of course, will be the ambassador to France, the sort of staging ground for the world revolution, then of Freemasonry. It's really kind of symbolic, I think, in that particular case.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this incredible Aether Hour episode. You are not going to want to miss the amazing discussion we continued having behind the paywall. Of course, we touch on China, Taiwan, the future of World War III, the future of NATO and its potential collapse. We talk a lot about a potential conflict between Russia and Turkey and how Turkey and Erdogan are expanding their neo-Ottoman empire. We also get into some pretty deep political analysis about the future of the political mechanisms of the United States and our democracy, as well as Western Europe, and how young men are really leading this charge that is going to capitalize on this inflection point that we are living through right now. So do not miss this fantastic analysis with Cameron Macgregor. All of his stuff, of course, is linked below. And if you help us get behind that paywall, you'll not only get full access to this episode, but all 67 plus of our other Aether Hour episodes. So hundreds of hours of uncensored, deep political, geopolitical, philosophical discussions with other amazing guests just like this one. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you all for the supporters that already keep this show going. You're the ones that make it all possible. And we will see you on the other side. God bless.